Welcome to the First Mentor podcast. Here, you will hear us talk about a variety of topics for the entire family that will hopefully spark a discussion, create a new curiosity, or simply teach you something new. The goal is to inspire you to learn life skills and soft skills not taught in school and prepare you to live an extraordinary life. Come on and spend some time with us on your commute to school or anytime you're free.
Hello, mentees. Welcome to episode 27 of the First Mentor podcast. And as usual, this is your host and mentor, Vanessa Yang. And today I have invited my friend, Gabriel Law, a book enthusiast, to talk about his love of reading and the widespread benefits related to this. And make sure at the end, please don't forget to subscribe, share our podcast with your friends and family, and leave us some feedback on Apple Podcast review sections or on Instagram. You can hashtag First Mentor Street. First is spelled 1ST Mentor Street. And without further delay, here's our interview with Gabriel. So today we have my friend Gabriel Law join us on this podcast. Welcome to the First Mentor podcast, Gabriel.
Thank you for inviting me, Vanessa.
Yes. And I know I've known you for over 10 years now, right? Your whole family. But I know you more from a personal basis, not so much professional. I just know you work at kind of like in digital marketing. So if you don't mind, can you share with our listeners a little bit more about your background and what you do?
Sure, yes. I am an immigrant from Hong Kong, arriving here in 1991 on the same day that Magic Johnson announced that he was retiring from the Lakers.
That was memorable.
Very memorable. First thing off the plane and watch on TV was him and his retirement announcement. Very fortunately, before my arrival in LA, my family was able to afford me a few years of boarding school in London. So I was a little bit more prepared in terms of assimilating into mainstream. I came here, I enrolled at UCLA, worked a few years in computer hardware marketing before getting a MBA from USC Marshall. Since then, the whole career has been in marketing, brand marketing, and now more so on digital marketing.
Yes, I know. That's great. So very marketing oriented. Normally, when I invite guests, I talk to them a lot about their professional background, but I invited you for a different reason here, right? Because one of the many things I've noticed and over the years with you, what stuck out with me and what I really admired is really your love of reading books. Like every time I see a picture, there's always your library in the background. How you read and with your children and what have you. And I wanted to talk specifically a little bit more about, your love of reading because I enjoy that very much myself. Did it start since you were really young? Is this something that came very natural to you, or is this more something your parents encouraged you to do while growing up?
It was very specific, actually, because it started with a copy of Reader's Digest. I believe it was January 1982.
You remember the date? That's awesome.
Well, it started with like a new subscription of the year, right? So it has to be. And I remember I was a fourth grader, so it has to be 1982. My father subscribed it. I'm not sure whether he intended for his son, me, right, and my sister to read it. Probably more so for himself.
Okay.
But I could just kind of pick it up. I don't think many listeners are familiar with Reader's Digest. Such an old item, right? It basically has a series of jokes scattered throughout each issue, right? And each article may be about a 6 or 7 minutes read, depending on how fast you want to move things along. But there's always a longer article towards the end. And then another article with an English translation. The one that my father subscribed was the Chinese version of the Reader's Digest.
Okay.
I remember that first issue that I read. The long article was about a political prisoner in one of the Eastern European country at the time. And just finished reading that, just kind of opened up a new world to me. And that's how reading is to me. It's about opening up new world.
Yes.
Reaching into the past or the future for that matter, right?
Wow, you have excellent memory too. I learned that about you just now. Very specific, even though it was so long ago, but it must have been very memorable to you to remember in such detail.
It helps that to just kind of remember like around what time, and it just kind of fall in place. Like, yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I agree with you that reading is really taking you away from your everyday life into new worlds, whether
Mhm.
they're real worlds or fictional and what have you, right? But what are your favorite types of books to read?
Mostly history, some science, and social movements in the US, in Hong Kong and China.
Mhm.
I have many favorite books.
I
I,
bet.
um,
Based on
I'm,
all the books you own.
I'm sure many readers actually would agree the same. But
Yeah.
most recently, and when I say recent, this book probably came out probably about 5 years ago now. The title is called The Measure of Civilization,
Okay.
by a British author named Ian Morris. He basically quantified how to measure. When people say that a civilization is advanced, like how do you quantify that? So he started
Hmm.
measuring calories intake, the kind of food that they consume, and the number of hours to get those kind of food ready, and the kind of population that that system can sustain, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting when people talk about history. Everything is just, oh, this king fight that war,
Yeah.
or that pope issued that kind of decree or whatever. But measuring it is an entirely different venture, and it was a very interesting book. May also recommend a book for parents to read to the kids,
Sure.
probably third grade and up. It's called A Little History of the World by E.H. Combridge. It's a German last name, so I probably butcher that.
How do you spell his last name? I'll help you with the pronunciation.
Please, yes. Gombrich.
Got it. So the author's name is E.H. Gombrich.
Yes.
Yeah.
He experienced First World War. This book was written like 50 years ago or something.
Okay.
It was written with the intention for kids to understand world history.
Oh,
It's
I
not
like
just
that.
about,
Yeah.
it's not just Europe or whatever. It started with Greece and a little bit of prehistoric
So
stuff. Then
ancient
Greek,
history even. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
all the way past Second World War and so on. It's
Okay.
fascinating. I just finished reading this about 200 pages to my kids, and
Mhm.
they find the human story very fascinating.
Yeah.
And I learned something new too.
Yeah, those are great books actually, because sometimes history is very complicated and
Yes.
probably not kids' most interested topics. So it's basically going back in time and probably putting it in layman's term for them to understand.
Yeah, very much so. I think especially when my older one is starting to get into like Lord of the Ring and the Hobbits and so on, is
Already?
as like kind of
Wow.
medieval, to not have the context of history and just read those books,
Yeah.
especially for a 9, 10 years old, it could be a little bit misleading. So
Yes.
I think this is the right time to get them to understand that just a little bit more. Nothing too crazy.
Well, I'm so impressed because, Lord of the Rings, I don't think I've read it in full. Obviously, I watched the movies, but
Mhm.
I've read it a little bit, and it was when I was younger. And I remember it being too complicated, so I put it down. But I don't remember when that was. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, it is very complicated. It's one of those books that you can go back to read over and over again, and
Hmm.
each time with something new, just because the author himself is so fascinating. He invented a whole language for the story,
Yes.
and there's all kind of really academic exercise behind it, and his interest in the Celtic culture and so on. Just you can go so deep in that
Wow, I'm
book.
so impressed. Yeah. I know my older daughter loves to read, but for a while, several years ago, she loved the Rick Riordan series, like Percy
Uh-huh.
Jackson and what
Yes.
have you. Like she devoured them, I think a book a day or sometimes two books a day. She just loved them so much. And now she's grown into a teen, so it's more like teenage books, right? But all
Yeah.
fiction. I personally love, I don't know why. I haven't read a fiction book for years. I normally read growth and development books.
Hmm.
I find them always very interesting. And then other books that I tend to read, because the last few years I try to learn more about healthier eating. So I've
Hmm.
been reading books related to nutrition. Like those have been my books for some reason. When I was younger, in my 20s or 30s, I really liked Dan Brown's books, right? From
Hmm.
Angels and Demon and Da Vinci Code, because what I really found fascinating is it's fiction, but a lot of the areas he visited, the architecture he talked about are all in real life. Because I grew up in Europe, so a lot of the places
Yes.
he kind of mentioned throughout his books, I was like, I've been there, or if not, I went afterwards. I loved his books for that reason, because I was able to connect with it, and it was very, thrilling to follow through.
Yeah, then Great. I've never wanted to visit Turkey so badly until his last book. The way that he described everything is just so fascinating.
Yes, yes, it's quite amazing. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the children because I still can't get
Yes.
over that your older girl, who is still fairly young to me, is reading such advanced book already. Because I think Lord of the Rings is that for teens or adults?
Probably for teens. I think the author wrote it for adults, but
Yes, I
then
thought so.
over time, like teens kind of get into it as well. I think any novels, any science fiction or fantasy fictions for that matter, as long as they create that realistic alternate world, alternate
Hmm.
universe, it
Yes,
just suck you in.
it totally does.
Yeah, so I think it's very easy, no matter what age you are, as long as you can understand 90% of the words on the page, you get sucked into that storyline very,
Hmm.
very quickly.
Completely agree. I assume, right, because they are so young but still so advanced when it comes to reading. Is this something you started with them at a very young age? I'm sure it's your influence. It's or is it just passed down through DNA? I'm sure it's your influence too.
To be honest, I actually never really pushed them. I mean, obviously, they saw me with a book plenty of
Hmm.
time,
Yes.
but then also not so much about, okay, every day, 6 to 7 o'clock before dinner, why don't you go ahead and read 1 hour? Like that, I don't think it worked. I would have guessed that that wouldn't work on me for
Hmm.
sure if my
Hmm.
parents forced me to do it. So I never really forced them onto it. But if I think about it, all the kids nowadays are so naturally inclined to read more. The schools really encourage them to do so.
Yes.
Libraries all around us have so many more resources and so on. If any homes just have a few more books and magazines lying around, I'm sure any kids, and I truly mean that, any kids would just naturally pick up one or two books sooner or later and just start exploring. It's not so much about reading that I
Yeah.
think is important. I think curiosity is more important in that
Hmm.
sense.
Yes.
It's all about them venturing to learn something new. And if they choose to learn that from YouTube or some other means, go ahead. As long as you have a curiosity that you want to satisfy.
Yeah, no, you make a good point. For me personally, based on my own kids' experience and the other kids I've been exposed to, it probably depends on the personality too. Maybe
Yeah.
because your kids have been exposed to seeing you read so much. So for them, it was very natural. Like I personally read, but not as much as I want to.
Hmm.
My husband doesn't read at all. They always make fun of daddy saying, Daddy, have you ever read a book before? But for my son, for example, he is really into playing video games like most boys are.
Hmm.
So for him to read, I have to push a little bit. But now they're currently reading Wonder in school.
Mm. Yes.
And it's such an excellent book because my daughter, when she went through the same grade, she read that as well. And I
Hmm.
remember at that time was when the movie came out. It was really good to read the book in school and then for us to be able to see the movie because it just teaches you so many things. And watching my son go through it, like I read it with him at night, like he actually really likes it because he can relate to it for age reasons and how boys are. And then we discuss certain issues too. And I think
Yes.
that's really important for them to be able to relate, have interest, and then that the book can teach you something too, right?
Hmm.
So I think that's a really great one. But since you read so much, do you have any other books for our audience that you suggest that they can read together as a family, maybe at the teenage level?
I read National Geographic magazines with them.
Oh,
So
okay.
yes, personality plays a role as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some kids are just not that into, oh my God, 200 pages of text. I'm not going to finish it. Uh,
Yeah.
but if you put something that's colorful with interesting graphics and graph and whatnot, it may attract them easier, right? So at least
Mm-hmm.
they can be interested in topics. And the good thing about a magazine is every issue they cover, I don't know, 12, 13 different topics.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be one topic that any young kids or even teenager would be interested in. It may not be something that they fully understand.
Yeah.
To be honest, there are issues that I don't fully understand for sure.
Yes, right. I
Right?
bet.
Have them understand that, oh, daddy is here to explore this issue with you together.
Mm-hmm.
It will be great. If you want to explore more, for sure, you can do that. We can go find more books to read and whatever. Going back to the whole curiosity
Mm-hmm.
as a focus, if you explore them to more things, and the good thing about graphics is also it leaves a deeper impression as well.
Yes.
There was one issue on the National geographic that talks about essentially just trash.
Oh, okay.
And so when we talk about trash, imagine if you have to read a book about trash, right? It won't be very. If you see one photo of it and the impact of trash on people living around it, on Earth, in the
Yeah.
ocean, and so on and so forth, it comes to a very different understandings. Occasionally, there'll be one or two books I read to them. But the other thing is also that because my kids' ages are so close to each other,
Yeah.
that the older one can so easily pass on, like, oh, this is the book that I just finished. Why don't you now go ahead and read it? In that sense, they become each other librarian. It's only very recently that the younger one finished a book that the older one has not read, and
He's catching up now.
he recommended to her, and that's a very interesting development. I also want to bring up one interesting thing, which is
Yes.
that aside from reading, when I picked them up from school,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I gave them a quote unquote research topic. They need to think of questions to ask Google. Everyone has a smartphone or one of those smart speakers at home now. It could be Alexa, but to ask Google to learn more about the topics. And we talk about like jungle versus rainforest, or how a dinosaur might have sounded like, or the size of a football field. First, I learned a lot too, right?
Yeah.
It seems easier to them because they only need to think of the questions instead of finding the answers. But you can always encourage them to kind of go one deep further to, oh, after this question, maybe you can go that other direction and ask that question as well. And it just kind of become a process. If feel they're being useful, they feel that they're learning, definitely keep the level of curiosity up.
Oh, I love this idea. So each day when you pick them up, you would say topic of the day is volcanoes. Or whatever, then they are the ones in charge of asking, the smart devices questions and finding the answers, like both the questions and the answers.
Correct.
Oh, that's such an interesting way of doing that. I like that.
And you know what? For a busy parent, very little work.
That's true. Just come up with a topic.
Yeah. All kids are just naturally curious.
Yes, that's true.
And these just help them to kind of guide them along a little bit. It's also, again, as I mentioned, I learn a lot too from that exercise.
I like that. I've never thought about that before. I mean, as a parent, I think nowadays we have to become a little bit more creative, right? Thinking of different things and what we could do with them and how we could encourage them. Like one of the things I started, I think it was 2 years ago. I saw that somewhere on the internet where a father gave his 11-year-old son a book to read and said, if you read each book that I pick, I'll give you $20. And it was more growth and development books because that's where he wanted to steer his son to read. And I thought that was a great idea. So I wanted to implement that. My son was like, Mommy, can I do that and earn the $20? And I said, yes, you have to read the book that I choose, but you have to write me a summary of what you learned.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes, not just read it, right? So then he said yes. And his first book was Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. I think he was 9 at that time. And I figured he might not get it. But dang, I should never underestimate kids because he read that and he was like, how do I make passive income? I want to make money now. Can we start a lemonade stand? And then it went into talking about assets and liabilities and income and expenses. Like he became like a mini accountant, right? I was like, oh my God, what has this book done to you? But it was awesome. And I feel like sometimes we underestimate them thinking they cannot read certain things. So then I continued with books like How to Win Friends and Influence People. So now he gives his father lectures. It's amazing what books could do with all these curious minds.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we're just here to nurture them, to help them grow. That's all.
I know you talked about the idea of reading books with them and magazines, which I think it's amazing. I never thought about magazines. But then also you mentioned there's no routine. So is there like a specific time or day of the week where you read and then you encourage the whole family to read? Or it's just whenever you have time as a family that you pick up a book?
I try not to make that very routine. Each family is different.
Yes.
We always have things to do. Each weeknight we do something. It could be chess, it could be playing other games. We have one evening dedicated to just picking interesting videos from YouTube to watch, for example.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Yes, I try not to do that. But the interesting thing is that even I don't do that, I find many times that they just pick up a book and read. They are very used to the idea that, oh, I got 15 minutes before I need to take my shower. So let me just finish reading this chapter or something.
Wow.
It's very easy to borrow books from library. If the kids is interested in borrow 5 books, go grab 15. The interest will spill over to other books. And if they end up not interested in it and just kind of flip through it, no harm done. You return it. Many libraries actually do away with late fees for kids' books.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, not all the libraries,
Not
but
all, yeah.
some do. I think it's tremendous incentive. You almost have no excuse not to do it now.
No, that's a good point. Now with COVID, I mean, I haven't been back to the library for over a year. We used to go every week because my daughter loved reading so much. She would finish 10, 15, 20 books in a week. So I couldn't go back to the library fast enough. But we haven't really gone. And as a result, she hasn't read as much. Do you know if libraries are actually back open?
Where I live, yes. If they are not open, they make many electronic books available to borrow. So that helps as well.
Yeah. Do you use the Libby app?
Yes.
Right. That's my lifesaver right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for those in the audience who've never heard about Libby before, it's Libby. And it's an app where you can basically connect your library card, right? You just register through your library card and you can electronically borrow books, audiobooks, I think magazines too, if I'm not mistaken. And there's so many different types of content. I actually use this for audiobooks because what I do with audiobooks is I just let that run while I'm folding laundry, just like people use podcasts, right? Or do some chores around the house. I just let the book run. In the past, when we used to commute, not anymore much, that's what I would do while I was commuting, really just put on a book that through Libby and listen to it in my car. That's the only time I had to read.
I think the audio component of that could be an app called Hoopla.
I haven't heard about that. Hoopla? Hoopla?
Yeah, Hoopla,
Okay.
yes. It works with Libby or on top of Libby, I guess is the way to put it. Definitely look up this app. I believe most libraries should have connection to Hoopla as well. So
I need to check that out. That's great because I think I can always use my audiobooks. I mean, what I love about it is I never get late fees because after 3 weeks, book disappears from my app.
Exactly.
And I always put new books on hold. Sometimes it takes a few weeks. Sometimes it takes months, depends on how popular that particular book is. What I love about it, if I'm not done with it and it gets returned, the next time I get it, it tracks exactly where I ended so I can continue listening to it. And that's amazing. Do you ever use Kindle Unlimited? Have you tried that out before?
I tried it out. I guess I'm not the target audience. It has tons of books, but not necessarily the kind that is always to the category or the topics that I love to dive deeper into. My only bad habits that I probably have enough books to last me 2 lifetimes already. So
you don't need more.
I don't need more. I need to actually reduce them somehow.
Yeah. We've tried Kindle Unlimited when I think it was Black Friday. Sometimes they gave promotions of 3 months free. And I thought, that would be great for my daughter because she loves reading. But for some reason, it didn't click with her. And then we ended up paying for another month or two. But since nobody started reading it, I just cancel and let it go. So I was just curious if that helped you. So I said, no, I'm just going to continue with Libby and have my audiobooks going from here.
Yeah.
I was curious. So I know your kids love reading, but let's say your family friends or their kids, right? Or family's kids, nephews and nieces or cousins, what have you. In case, let's say their kids are more attracted by video games or social media or watching short form content on YouTube, like you mentioned, if that's what they care about and reading is really not on their interest list, is there any other way? I know you mentioned a few earlier where you feel like you could encourage them to discover books a little bit more?
Well, first, let me say that, do you play some video games? Do you watch some short form content? I think
too much.
Yeah.
one of my kids, actually both of them, in a way, too much electric devices.
Again, the focus is on nurturing curiosity, right? So if they learn something from video games, which some games do have that, then by all means do it. To me, is the parents ask themselves first, right? Do I read enough? Do I
good point.
sit in front of the TV and try to catch up with all the Netflix and whatever HBO Max or whatever, and then, hey kids, go finish that book, right? That wouldn't work, right? So if the parents read, and in general the family knows that TV is just kind of reserved for or other form of entertainment, I should say, are reserved for very specific time or occasions or whatever, and during a downtime, a lot of times what daddy and mommy will do is just to learn something and so on, then they probably imitate, right?
Yes, it's a very
So
good point. So we
yeah,
have to look into ourselves,
yes,
right?
yes,
Self-reflect a little bit. And it's actually a very good point, especially I've read and heard from other friends during the pandemic when we're all home, we all tend to watch a little bit too much TV, a lot more than we probably want to. And then before you know it, the whole day is gone. I mean, sometimes I'm guilty of binge watching. So I have to tell myself, once the season is over, I have to stop. You're right. We have to self-reflect as a parents because they do tend to imitate. So it's just changing our own habits for them to change them.
yes. I make the same mistakes also. I mean, every parent is different, and we all work. We all get tired, at one point during the day,
Hmm.
making lunch, making dinner, and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's just like you do want to just sit down in the couch, turn on TV, let your mind kind of dissolve into the ether for a little bit. But then you know what? The kids would be doing the same thing.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
think doing it a little bit is fine. But if you don't want the kids to imitate you, then you don't do it yourself. Yeah,
Yep.
that's
You're
all.
right. You cannot do one thing, but tell them in words to do something else. That doesn't work with them.
Yeah.
I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into benefits of reading besides the
Mhm.
obvious, right, of learning more. What other benefits do you think reading brings to our audience?
Each reader can be different, but to me, when I finish a book,
Mhm.
especially a good book, my world changes a little bit, like at a fundamental level,
Okay.
right? If I read a history on the Egyptian, right, ancient Egyptian, and learn, what they had to do to build that pyramid,
Yeah.
right? You start to look at, like, these are not, oh, they are like 4,000 years ago. They must be backward. They don't even have flushing toilet. Like, no, they are advanced in so many other ways. And
Yes.
each good book changes your world all over again. So that
Mm.
to me is the benefit. It's almost like people listening to music, and good music really moves you, right?
Yeah.
So good books move you in the way that you understand the world differently. And this does not really just apply to nonfiction. If you read romantic novels and you really identify with the characters,
Hmm.
the way that you approach love or romance, or your relationship with others would be different too,
Yeah.
right? So, you close the book and you enter a new world. All the people around you, they just act normal, right? To them, the world has not changed, but to me, it changes a lot, especially on like science book or books that talks about some of the more pressing issues like climate change and other stuff.
Mm.
Like,
Hmm.
oh, you feel like you understand, you're one step closer to the truth, but then you see your neighbors are still doing something that's not entirely environmentally friendly. It's just like, okay. I also think that reading helps you live your life many times over,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And sometimes you kind of pick up a different identity as well. Like, I'm a marketer, right? I do marketing, but if I'm reading the life story of Beethoven, right, I'm
Hmm.
suddenly back in Vienna in 18th century. I need to understand. I start to understand, I should say, people with disability, like losing hearing during that age. What was that like? Beethoven is a very interesting character.
Hmm.
All the musicians today, all the pop stars, they make so much money. They should thank Beethoven. Beethoven was the first musician to make money from royalties.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, fascinating, right? So,
Yeah.
like, okay, now your world fundamentally changes too, right? The main benefit is that, like, you see the world differently
Yeah, you can escape to somebody else's world and live that for a little bit.
for a little bit, yes, and then you turn back and then you look at your world differently. It's a two-way street, yes.
Yeah, no, that's very true. It's the escape part because I think when I was a teenager, I loved reading because my life was mundane and I had to, work at my parents' restaurants growing up and
Hmm.
going to school, and it was like the same thing over and over every day. But reading a book just took me away and let me escape reality for a little bit and get a little bit more excitement or some unknown, made it more interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, we just didn't have the chance to find that right topics or the right author to
Yeah.
start on that path. Each of us, obviously, growing up, have different experience, but I'm sure a lot of us went through, working part time, going to school,
Hmm.
juggling different tasks and whatnot. And reading would not be something that is, constantly in the background. I mean, you have your schoolwork, obviously, but
Yes.
outside of that, a lot of us just didn't have that chance to come across that good book that, start that journey. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other benefit I can think of is imagination. So, for example, a lot of good books are made into movies, right? When I talk to my daughter about certain books, she's like, I want to read the book, because when she's like me, when once you've read the book and you watch the movie, you're actually very disappointed, because a movie cannot capture all the essence the book is telling you, right? The thoughts, the feelings, they can only do so much. It always leads, I think 99% of the time, to a disappointment, because we always tell my husband again to read, and he's like, I don't want to read. I just watched the movie. And we're like, no, it's not the same. For me, when I read the book, I imagine how the main character looks like. I have a picture in my mind, and the location they went through based on the author description in my mind. I'm like, okay, this is where they're at. And normally in movies, the person turned out nice, but not as good looking as I imagined. Or the location was great, but not as extravagant as I imagined too.
For example, I would not have chosen, like, I did not envision Matt Damon as the Martian, like the main character in The Martian.
I haven't read the book yet, but okay. Yeah. You read it first before you watched the movie, right?
Yes. I knew about the book for a long time, and then they said they're making it into a movie. And then I said, okay, I better read the book first. So that that's typically how I get pushed into reading a fiction book, is that I learn about it about to be made into a movie. In my mind, it would be someone more like Guy Pearce. Anyway, it's the nerdy side of me talking here, but
it's true, because we, in our minds, we
exactly
can envision, hey, this is the actor that we would cast for this specific role, and then we get disappointed because somebody else was casted, right?
Yeah. I mean, he did a fine job. I shouldn't complain. You're exactly right in the point that the way that you envision how that story unfolds and the characters being built up and so on, a lot of times is vastly different to how Hollywood has to make things work. They look at box office and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. And the other thing I've realized, especially for children and teens, your vocabulary changes, right? Because once you read, you have a lot more choices. And if you read over and over again, you pick up new words. Also, besides learning, you become, I think, independent in a way, right? You learn from books where you're like, okay, now I can implement certain tasks into my own life or certain responsibilities. So I think that's also very interesting.
You can only think in terms of the words you know, right?
Yes.
So your vocabulary kind of limit your imagination in that way. Reading more, understanding more words, and so on and so forth is vitally important in that sense.
Yeah. One last thing I can think of is when you read, you can sometimes, especially when you're young and you're still trying to find yourself, problems to you are like huge, just the whole world, and you feel like you're alone by yourself going through that one problem. But as you read a book and the main character goes through something else, you finally feel like, wait a minute, I'm not alone. Or here are potential solutions to what I'm going through. Somebody else went through it already, right?
Exactly the way to put it. I think as an immigrant, that is even more true. I think a lot of times we may have the capability to achieve something, but there's always that self-doubt. And then there's always that, am I good enough question, especially with Asian background.
Yeah.
But to see other people doing it, to know of people having overcome that, either in the story or reading biographies and whatnot, that's very helpful.
Yeah. Biographies is actually another very interesting area. When I read about, for example, Steve Jobs or Elon Musk's biography, it just opened my mind, because I was like, oh, I didn't know Steve Jobs was actually adopted, or all the things he has to go through when he was growing up, because the adoption kind of made him feel abandoned. And that feeling of abandonment, how it drove him to create and who he became, I thought that was really fascinating to read.
I think all the stories are very interesting. My wife and I just watched a movie on Amazon Prime about Madame Curie. It's called Radioactive.
Yeah,
so,
I was gonna watch that. I haven't had a chance yet. Tell me.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating story. I mean, we probably all learn about, first female Nobel Prize winner and so on. But the movie did a great job in terms of really presenting the case on how much prejudice she faced in that period. We kind of expected that, but then having something presented to you visually and knowing her brilliance and yet all the things that was declined to her just make that so much more. This is one of the thing that I think sometimes watching a movie is faster than reading a biography for sure, but then also
true.
You get the emotional side of things better as well.
Yeah. Just to go back with that, can you watch this with the kids, or is this more adult focused, like the content?
I was going to watch it with the kids, and then the warning said there are brief nudity. So I'm like, okay, no.
I hear you. Thanks for the warning. I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to wrap up with, I'm trying with the podcast, as I mentioned to you before,
Mhm.
really to encourage teens and young adults kind of learn soft skills and life skills that they're not learning in school, right? So one of the,
Mhm.
that's why I come up with the topic, for example, of reading, because reading just brings so many benefits. Now, from your experience, right now being an adult and going through all the things you've gone through, is there another area or topic that you would encourage the youth to look into developing, like certain new habits that would really help them to become full-blown adults in later life?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, which is self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone would agree after 2020, right, with the election and COVID and so on, that our society is not working as well as it can be.
Yes.
We probably have seen or heard plenty of criticism about different politics, or the media is wrong, or social medias, and so on and so forth. But no one ever says anything bad about the voters, which is us.
Mm-hmm.
And one day, the teen and the young adults in the audience, we live in a democracy, so we are the boss.
Mm-hmm.
If something is wrong, we are also in the wrong. We are responsible for it.
Yeah.
So we have to learn to own up to our responsibilities, at least know that we can always be more informed,
Mm-hmm.
be less opinionated,
Mm-hmm.
be patient, and be most critical only towards oneself. It's very easy to just, point at different
Yes.
entities and say, they did this wrong, they did that wrong, but
Ask yourself, what have you done about it?
exactly.
That's a very good point. As the next generation is growing up,
Mhm.
taking on responsibilities, looking in the mirror and self-reflect. So true. I've read that so much, especially with social media. Like people hide behind the keyboards. So it's so easy for them just to make a comment, right? Somebody does
Mhm.
something and they don't know the whole story or everything that's going on behind the scenes. But they see one thing and there they go off with criticizing right away without knowing what's going on. And then in addition, what have they done about it? So that's actually a very good point about self-reflection and taking on the responsibility yourself first, right? Without pointing fingers right away. So I like that. If our listeners want to follow you or maybe hear a little bit more about you, where can they find you?
I have a Facebook account. If someone really wants to find me on Facebook and say, hey, they have listened to this podcast and find some of the things that we have discussed interesting and want to dive a little bit more, they can certainly reach out. I'd love to chat with people and learn about their point of view, their opinions, and most of all, learn what kind of books they are reading. So,
Great.
yeah. So find me on Facebook if they want.
Okay, Gabriel Law.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabriel. I think, I always knew you loved reading. I just didn't know what you loved. So I got to know you better today, which I always appreciate, especially friends that I've known for years, but just getting to know them from a different side is awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. And just one last observation. This is interesting. I think for a lot of young kids, especially teenagers, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in trying to figure out more about your future, your career path, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my observation. My great-grandfather, as far as I know, was most likely a farmer. My grandfather was a kind of a first-generation industrialist in Hong
Mm-hmm.
Kong. He had a factory that does electroplating. He did not understand chemistry, but he knew the right chemical to put in, and after mixing it at this temperature, something happened, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, just enough.
My great-grandfather would not understand what my grandfather was doing.
Yes, very true.
My father was a social officer who sat in an office and basically doing typewriting or writing reports the whole day. My grandfather would not understand what my father is doing.
Mm-hmm.
I am in online marketing. My father probably understands a little bit of what I'm doing, but then not too much. If you ask my mom what I do, she has more than 25 years consistently give the wrong answer. She said I'm in sales. I'm not, but I'm pretty sure that I would not quite understand what my kids will be doing.
Yes,
And
that's such a good point.
And that's all to say that the world is changing too fast. The only way to survive, in my opinion, is really just keep an open mind. The job that you may end up doing the longest, and you may do way more than one job or one career,
Yeah.
may not even exist today.
True. So
So
true.
so don't listen to old fart like me to tell you what to do. Your job may not exist, and I would not have any input to it. And if someone tell you otherwise, you need to really judge, what he or she is saying, how much that would be true 10 years down the road, 20 years down
Yeah.
the road, and so on. Just be true to yourself, enjoy. If you stay curious and keep learning, I'm sure good things will come to you.
Oh, I love that. That is actually such a good point because I did read the jobs that our children will be doing. I think the majority of it doesn't exist today yet. And that's why I kind of emphasize soft skills and life skills so much because it's all about, being flexible, having your imagination, taking initiatives, learning, because those are the skills you can take with you no matter where you go and no matter how the world changes. But if it's like hard facts, very specific technical skills, they do change, right? Like you said, several generations ago, most of them were farmers, but that skill does not help us too much nowadays, right? If that's all you knew, then we would be in trouble today. So it's really keeping an open mind and keep learning. I love that message. So thanks for sharing that.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah. And I had such a great time talking with you. Thanks so much for your time, Gabriel.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much.
Hope you enjoyed our interview with Gabriel Law. Now, whether you love books or don't really just have any patience to even read one, you probably have to agree with us that reading has huge benefits for you, right? So, here's my challenge to you for this episode. Just go and do some quick research, and this could include talking to your parents or your friends, and select 3 titles that might seem a bit interesting to you for you to read in the next few months. And, audiobooks are acceptable. And let us know what you selected, what your experience was, and what you learned. You can comment on Instagram, just hashtag #FirstMentorStreet, and that is spelled 1STMeonTorStreet. Would love to hear from you. And thanks again, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. Have an amazing day.